Pleased to see all of you here as we think today about the relationship between the environment and conflict, something that is experienced at all different levels, from the international to the very local. You'll find that the visitors on campus today for the symposium represent a variety of perspectives, from the abstract and analytical to the very concrete and practical, even dealing with their own work experiences. As you may know, we are modifying today's schedule due to weather-related travel problems on the East Coast. But all is good. I'm thrilled about that, since we're just flipping the 11 o'clock and 4 o'clock talks. I'm so pleased that our speaker today, Shiloh Fetzek, was game to talk at 11 as opposed to 4. And I think you'll really enjoy her talk. I want to direct you to the small brochure that many of you have probably seen, and I think is available somewhere in this room, which lists the original schedule, but also biographical information about each of the symposium guests. The new schedule, just to repeat, has Lisa Dale at 4 o'clock. And then, as originally planned, a buffet dinner at 5:30 after Lisa, but before the evening panel, and then a 6:30 evening panel. There are a couple of events that are not in the schedule, informal drop-in events that I want to alert you to as well. One is a drop-in session today from 2:30 to 3:30 in Macy House, which is right across Park Street from Carnegie, on the first floor in the conference room. Some of our symposium guests from today will be available. I'm not sure who, but stop by, and we've got some cookies and candy for you, and at a minimum, I'll be there, and we'll look forward to talking to you. And then tomorrow, in Spencer Grill from 10:30 to 11:30, one of the guests from tonight, Brandy Jansen, who is an alumna from 1998, and her husband, Mark Jansen, who graduated the year before. And they're very interesting. They have a wide range of interests, from music to econ to anthropology, agriculture. They're going to be in the Spencer Grill. So stop by and talk to them. I think you'd find that very interesting as well. So, enough of me. Let me introduce you to our convocation speaker, Shiloh Fetzek. She's a security analyst with the Center for Climate and Security, an institute that focuses on the nexus of climate and security, two of those things that are really driving this symposium. I look forward to hearing her talk about some stories, and also introduce an analytical framework, risk mapping, to help us understand the relationship between climate and security, as well as a risk management approach that will give us a feel for how to respond to the risk. So please join me in welcoming Shiloh Fetzek.
Can you hear me? Yeah. Thank you so much, Barb and Lorena and all of your colleagues at the Rosenfield program. It's a delight to be here with you and to give you a bit of an introduction to this field. As Barb mentioned, I come from the Center for Climate and Security. We are a nonpartisan policy and research institute in DC, working at the nexus of climate and security. So I'm going to cover three things. Basically, what's the nature of the risk? How do climate change and security drivers intersect? How do we turn an understanding of that nexus into actionable information? And how do we actually act on that? What needs to happen? So this is a relatively new field of study, integrating pretty sound climate science and climate impact projections with security assessments. So even though it's a demonstrated driver of insecurity and instability, and will clearly affect the future security environment. And even though the information that we have about this is a lot more sound than a lot of the other information that's used for security projections. So if you go back to the late 60s when the first climate models first came into being, their projections about the future are reasonably sound, whereas a political analyst from that time could have had very little idea of the contours of our current geopolitical landscape. So just as with the rest of climate change, as we're formulating this architecture to reshape infrastructure, the economy, a similar process needs to happen in the security realm. So I'll talk through what that could look like and how we get there. So this graphic illustrates the basic interrelationship between climate impacts on the one hand and the drivers of insecurity. Climate change is happening in the context of a lot of other major changes that are reshaping security dynamics and the geopolitical space. So just very quickly kind of move through these. So local resource competition in the absence of effective dispute resolution can increase tensions, and this is happening in the context of decreasing supply and increasing demand. And that can give rise to local tensions, especially in places that are already strained or face internal divisions and marginalization. Extreme weather events and disasters, of course, destroy livelihoods and strain governance systems, and also diminish economic opportunities in the near term and destroy resources. So a lack of disaster response and effective intervention on the part of the government can fuel grievances, especially if there's an uneven or an inadequate response from governments. Volatile food prices and provision. So climate change, as we know, is highly likely to disrupt food production in many regions. And again, this is a case of supply decreasing and demand increasing. So that can, price volatility and high prices can lead to unrest, local conflict, especially where poverty and poor governance come into play and where a country is highly dependent on imports. Transboundary water management. Unfortunately, a lot of transboundary basins are in fragile areas. So if you think of the Nile or the countries whose water supplies are dependent on meltwater from the Himalayan glaciers. We haven't seen water conflicts come to blows in the past, but what we know is that the past is not necessarily a good predictor for future conditions. Sea level rise and coastal degradation, as we know, even before a country gets submerged, there will be a lot of negative impacts on the economic infrastructure that's located on the coast, displacement and migration patterns, and that can increase tensions in receiving areas. Also, maritime boundary delimitations are defined by coastlines. As sea level rise reshapes those, that could lead to conflicted tensions over ocean resources, which are also defined according to coastlines and maritime boundaries. Lastly, and something that we should really keep an eye on, are the unintended effects of climate policies. Adaptation carries a lot of risks with it as well, as it's essentially a form of resource allocation. So if you think about unintended consequences of, for example, palm oil and biofuels, we're trying to learn from that and try and anticipate how new adaptation projects will reshape power dynamics and ecologies in places where they're implemented. So I'm going to tell a few stories to illustrate the ways that some of these have come about and highlight different aspects of the climate security nexus. So what have we seen? You may be familiar with the case study of Syria and climate change and the role that climate change played in the origins of the conflict. Basically what happened was that in the years prior to the uprising, Syria experienced the deepest drought in its history, the deepest drought in the instrument record, and the worst in the last 900 years. And that was made 2 to 3 times more likely due to climate change. So this drought, this extreme drought, the farmers are pretty used to dealing with drought. It happens all the time. But when you get successive years of very little precipitation, it was beyond what they could cope with. And this was happening in the context of very poor water resource management practices in the country, and as well as economic restructuring underway that pushed 2 to 3 million Syrians into extreme poverty and displaced about 1.5 million of them from the countryside, from the breadbasket of the country toward the cities in the west. And there's a sectarian element to this in that the rural Shia the Sunni eastern part of the country were moved into the Alawite Shia minority part of the country. So there's an elite Shia minority that rules the country, and the rural farmers relocated to tent camps that were set up around Damascus, Aleppo, Dara, and other cities that already had huge refugee populations from Iraq and from Palestine. So there was a lot of competition for jobs and next to no government aid. And that exacerbated an already existing humanitarian crisis that was happening on the ground. And that situation of there being this crisis highlighted the incapacity and the unwillingness of the Assad regime to meet the needs of the majority of the people. So there's a lot of kind of boiling frustration. And what happened was in March 2011, when the Arab Spring was happening elsewhere in the region, a group of youth, they spray painted a protest chant onto a wall in Daraa, and they were arrested and tortured, and one of them died in custody. And there were protests over their mistreatment. And those protests were strongly suppressed by the Assad regime. And that in turn sparked more protests, and from there, the uprising escalated into the tragic civil war that we find before us today. And it wasn't climate change or even the drought that caused the uprising in Syria, but it was an extreme climate abnormality that took place in the context of poor governance, gross resource mismanagement. So they were using flood irrigation and canals to grow wheat in the desert. At the same time as they had economic restructuring that canceled fertilizer and fuel subsidies. And that made it far more difficult for farmers to transport their goods to market or to run the water pumps that irrigated their crops. That in the context of sectarianism and the unprecedented crisis in the region helped the conflict ignite. And this example is instructive because it's the kind of extreme that will be by no means unusual in the future in the Middle East. An already arid region is going to dry out and heat up drastically. And it shows really how water insecurity and other climate impacts through intermediary factors can act on conflict drivers, even in a place that is presumed to be relatively stable. Nobody thought that Syria would fall during the Arab Spring. Everyone thought that it was immune to it, and yet it's one of the more lasting and violent conflicts that's arisen from that. Speaking of the Arab Spring, it helps to illustrate how hazards are globalized in the context of climate change. So again, there's a climate element at the root of it. In 2011, there was really weird weather around the world. There was a drought in China, wildfires in Russia, and abnormal weather in Canada as well. And so all major wheat exporters were not exporting as much, and China in particular kind of panic bought on the international market, and that doubled global wheat prices. So 9 of the 10 top wheat importing countries are in the Middle East and North Africa, and Egypt was the top one. Prior to the Arab Spring, bread prices tripled, and it was a contributory factor, along again with a suite of other grievances that contributed to civil unrest. And that, the fire really caught across the region, which is not a bad thing, of course. There were many reasons to challenge the governments in power at the time, but it was also a factor in the grievances in Syria. So climate impacts that happen on the other side of the world can really be a factor in instability elsewhere due to the globalization of markets. And what happens over there in terms of climate impacts doesn't stay over there. Similar story in some ways. Yemen helps to highlight a different story in that whether or not climate factors play a role in the origins of conflict. And I have to say that this is a matter of some academic debate about how to weight the relative importance of climate impacts among a suite of issues that help a conflict to arise. Whether or not it played a role in originating the conflict, it can certainly make it harder to bring to a close or make it more likely that a post-conflict society will tip back into violence. So Yemen, running out of water anyway, climate change again, really going to dry out the Arabian Peninsula. Climate change will exacerbate all of that water scarcity. And how will a country that's currently in the throes of a conflict be returned to stability when they're not really able to rebuild their economies. Furthermore, many of these countries, especially in the MENA region and elsewhere too, have huge youth bulges. They coincide with a lot of these risk factors. And if you have a large unemployed young male population, there's a really strong correlation statistically between the risk of violence and livelihoods and employment opportunities for young people. So without adequate governance to support economic growth, there will be more people at a loose end and more grievances. As I mentioned before, though, adaptation, there are risks associated with adaptation as well. So say you're going to spend a lot of money trying to sort out Yemen's resource management issues and scarcity issues. Water availability is tied to economic productivity and energy production. So as climate change exacerbates water scarcity, it acts as a major constraint on growth and development. Water, as you know, is critical for agricultural productivity, and by decreasing this, of course, is linked with intensifying food insecurity. So there are power and politics elements in deciding how to approach these kind of wicked problems. By exacerbating water insecurity, climate change can also affect the perceptions of access or perceptions of inequality in systems of power. And oftentimes, it's not about the absolute scarcity or abundance of a resource, it's about the narrative and how you understand how it's being distributed. And that's particularly tricky in a post-conflict society where you have a lot of tensions and again, a narrative of conflict. So any decision, as I said, about adaptation is also about resources and power. And allocating water is about allocating economic opportunities and livelihoods, which will get trickier. Climate change, of course, will bring new dynamics of winners and losers. It will redraw the map in a lot of ways that way. Who gets the benefits of a particular project? If you build a dam, who decides whether the water goes for irrigation, for industry, for fisheries? These are complicated questions. How will those trade-offs be negotiated? Who makes the decisions about that? So tensions, again, there's a potential for them to be rife around adaptation projects. Same story, similar story in Afghanistan. If you look at a society that's currently struggling in some way, be it Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan, just add climate and think about how much more complicated it will be to resolve these difficult challenges. So if a farmer in Afghanistan relies on meltwater from the Himalayas, and that's going to be diminishing over time, they have to choose whether to grow wheat or poppies. An opium poppy can generate a much higher economic return per unit of irrigated land. The reliability of water flows from the Himalayas will be changing over time. Of course, there's a link to the Taliban and non-state armed groups. They thrive on the opium trade and on illicit economic activities. So what's the future trend in Central Asia? If a government can't regain control of an area from armed groups, they can strengthen, train, and operate there. So that's true in Syria, it's true in northern Nigeria, and a range of other places. If the youth have no other option or other economic sectors are bottoming out, what are they going to do? So in many ways, these issues relate and they compound each other. Once a situation is unstable, it's really difficult to implement climate adaptation measures because there has to be a minimum level of safety and security for anyone to go in and build an infrastructure project. You have to have insurance, right? You're not going to get that in an area that's experiencing instability. So that makes them, again, it compounds a sort of downward spiral in that it makes these places more vulnerable to climate impacts and to the potential security repercussions. So it's really self-reinforcing. It's also the case that the areas that are currently fragile or are conflict affected are the most vulnerable. So the atlas on the left combines multiple risk factors that are related to food security, poverty, governance capacity, adaptation capacity, and so forth. And the chart on the right shows areas where conflicts were active the year before last. Unfortunately, they stopped updating that map, so that's a couple years old, but I think a lot of the trends still hold. So there's a high degree of overlap, as you can see, between between areas that are vulnerable and areas that are experiencing conflict and instability. Although simply overlapping doesn't necessarily speak to the role that climate-related factors might have played in this instability and conflict, but it does illustrate that there are areas that are of particular concern. So as you can see, it's the countries that are already struggling that are the most vulnerable, that have difficulties with poor governance and social and political instability and economic challenges, and that limits their ability to build up resilience to the climate impacts that they're going to be most exposed to. And it's the poorest countries and the most vulnerable people within these countries that are the most at risk. However, the risk is not just limited to developing countries. There are a lot of ways in which climate change intersects with, again, traditional security issues. Just to add climate, right? Terrorism. Also the nuclear threats. As part of their commitments to the Paris Climate Agreement, many countries have stated an intention to ramp up nuclear power in their energy mix. And there are a lot of, we shouldn't hit the brakes by any means on transitioning to a lower carbon economy, but we should also be cognizant of the risks that are that can be part of that transition. So for example, the installations themselves might be vulnerable to climate impacts. Of course, they need cooling capacities, so many are located on the coast. We're not really convinced that a thorough understanding of future sea level rise risk is being incorporated into the planning for this. They rely on water. What happens if there isn't enough water? As is being seen now in some countries in Africa who have built these fantastic hydropower projects, but they don't work anymore because they don't have water. Similar risks associated with nuclear. Furthermore, many of the countries, Bangladesh, Pakistan, others, Philippines, has stated an intention to increase nuclear in their energy mix, have non-state armed groups that are active, and also a very lax record on nuclear materials security. There's also a question around the geopolitics of who supplies nuclear technology and materials. So China is positioning itself to be a major supplier of technology and materials to countries who are looking to develop this, particularly in Asia, but elsewhere as well. The US used to be in that position, and with that came a lot of norms and expectations around nuclear safety that may not necessarily come with a change in supplier. They're also establishing a 100-year relationship with those countries. And so it changes the geopolitics and the balance of power. Similar story in the Arctic in terms of geopolitics and an impact on the security dynamics. So China is an energy technology exporter in a number of ways. Of course, a major exporter of renewable technologies. Many of those require rare earth minerals, and China has a near monopoly on rare earths. Greenland, as it happens, is very rich in rare earth minerals. And China has been courting Greenland to strengthen a move for independence from Denmark. They've been a Danish colony for the last 600 years or so. And so they've been making overtures to support Greenlandic independence. Right now they are semi-autonomous in that Denmark still looks after their foreign policy and defense policy. And of course Greenland is still a major, did the sound go on this? Yeah. Does this work? I'll try leaning on this one. Excuse me. Should Greenland become fully independent from Denmark? No? All right. Between the two of these, something is going to work. So a fully independent Greenland would put into question Denmark's ability to take responsibility as a NATO member for patrolling its segment of the Arctic. So, each NATO member countries, which as you can see in the Arctic, it's basically NATO versus Russia up there. Denmark's ability to maintain its security operations may come into question, which of course could have an impact on the geostrategic balance in an area that's being completely reshaped by climate change. So these are just a handful of examples that illustrate, that touch on some of the many ways that a completely reshaped geophysical condition and environment will have an impact on geopolitics and in the security sphere as well. And these issues might emerge in really surprising ways. As I mentioned earlier, maritime boundary delimitations are defined by coastlines. Well, there's not really any regulatory framework for what happens when those coastlines move. There's a highly contentious issue in the South China Sea, and the relationship that China has with its neighbors in the region. Similarly, geoengineering is an option that many countries are looking toward as it becomes less and less likely that we will meet a 1.5 degree or 2 degree target. There's a complete lack of international governance around geoengineering, and there could be potential security repercussions of countries pursuing these options unilaterally, or for that matter, private sector entities pursuing geoengineering. So, moving on to risk mapping. So while these issues might emerge in surprising ways, we can't claim to have been completely surprised about how these issues might arise. Like never before in history, we have the scientific and technological tools that can provide advanced warning about the future security environment. And there are many efforts underway to integrate the physical and social sciences, to integrate climate projections and conflict analysis, and use new technologies to get a better handle on how exactly these issues might emerge and how we can get ahead of them. And the idea really is to take what we understand about this nexus and use it to tilt our existing activities around humanitarian aid, development, climate adaptation, peace building, disaster response, many of which blend together, and tilt those to support climate resilience and peace and stability. So this is one example from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, which is based at UT Austin. What they do is they track all reported political violence and protest events across Africa and South Asia, and Southeast Asia and the Middle East. And they incorporate climate vulnerability into that analysis. And that can help to gauge what type of interventions are useful and where. So they're directly inputting to USAID's programming. Where do we need to put water projects? What's effective? To what degree do we need to involve local community actors? How can this work in an effective way? How can we use our aid budgets to match effect? They do a similar project in South Asia to understand climate-related hazards and vulnerabilities in South and Southeast Asia, and how climate change will exacerbate existing threats. Asia, of course, is highly exposed and vulnerable to climate-related hazards, and yet it's not an area that the Middle East, certainly in the U.S., gets a lot more. Middle East and Africa get a lot more attention. Another example is the Notre Dame Global Adaptation Initiative. So that summarizes the country's vulnerability to climate change and other global challenges in combination with its readiness to improve resilience. And again, the idea is to inform governments, businesses, and communities on how to prioritize investments for a more efficient response to the immediate global challenges ahead. And it's interesting because this makes intuitive sense, I hope, as I'm explaining this, that these things are going to be connected. And yet, because of the kind of institutional inertia involved in these fields, you'll see very little true incorporation of climate-related threats into the work of a lot of international institutions. So, for example, I was at a World Food Program event in Oxford in September, and they convened all these people, flew them all in there, talking about, what are we going to do about the fact that Syria is taking something like 60% of World Food Program's aid budget right now. And they were talking about, when the farmers return and, we start to rebuild the agriculture, there's really a lack of incorporation of climate futures into the thinking of humanitarian organizations. And the same with disaster response. It's often the case that, there's a return to the status quo, let's rebuild things as they were, rather than thinking 20, 30, 50, 100 years into the future, and considering what are the needs going to be, how can this support economic activity in the climate reality that we're going to be facing. Working on a shorter time frame, there is some work and activity happening around incorporating climate and environment issues into conflict early warning systems and working to integrate early indicators that are related to those. So there's this, there are initiatives in the Horn of Africa, for example. The EU's conflict early warning system does a good job of integrating these. But it's not enough to simply be cognizant of the risks. The best designed, most effective conflict early warning system is only as good as the action that it inspires. Am I getting feedback here? No? Okay. We can anticipate that the risks are going to be unprecedented, but how do we go about structuring a response? We're faced with unprecedented risks to security and stability, but that's accompanied by unprecedented foresight capabilities. And we can see the risks coming, and especially when it comes to climate modeling, that information really is quite sound. There's a lot of uncertainty, but at least it's bound. The uncertainty is at least bounded. So the way that we like to